For today's Bible study, we'll be reading from chapter 8 in the Gospel according to Mark. There is no introduction really that I have for this Bible study for today, so we'll just pick up and begin for now. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Yeshua called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. To stop before we read verse 4, we see in the opening part of this chapter that once again there's a large crowd of people, and they are following after Yeshua, much like the example, or much like the time which we have previously read about the 5,000 men, and surely I believe there was women and children also with them, so that there would have been a greater number of people. We see as Yeshua fed them, had fed such a large quantity and such a massive number of people. So also for this time also, there's another large crowd of people following after Yeshua. And the notable thing, which I think is important for us to remember, is to see the level and the sincerity and just how much compassion Yeshua has for the people. And seeing that they have really no food as far as the people are concerned, and that they have been following after him for about 3 days. And some of the people at that have even come from a great distance. We see not only the popularity of Yeshua, that so many people would come from great distances to see him and to see the works which he would do and to come and hear from him. But aside from that, with so many people who are following after Yeshua, there would have been a major commitment on their part to be following after him and to follow after him for such a great time, even though it might have been a few days. But considering where these people had come from, it would have been uh, a great journey, I would imagine, for most of them. And so we basically see that Yeshua, in having compassion for the people who have come a long way to follow after him, he wants to provide for them. And we see that he will do just that. And so in verse 4, and his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground. And taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. To stop here briefly, we see much like the previous time when Yeshua had fed the vast number of people, that previous time and for this next time where he is feeding the 4,000 people, they're not entirely different, but rather the same, because even though the numbers might not be completely the same, it's still overall a very large amount of people which he is providing for. And as he has bread and fish, once again Yeshua is giving thanks and blessing the food as he did previously. And upon having the people sit down in an organized fashion, to have them sit in groups where it would have been much more easier for them to receive the food, instead of having just a large crowd of people reaching in all over the place and trying to take what they can, by having the people, as Yeshua commanded, for them to sit down in organized groups, and in groups of whatever numbers they were for this second time, it would have been much easier to provide or not really to provide, but to have a much more simpler and easier process of getting the food out to the people by the disciples going to groups after groups. That would have made things a little bit more easier. And we see also that the people, upon eating the food, they were satisfied. And so it was not that Yeshua, in having the food and after blessing it and giving thanks for the food, that he gave the food to all the people and that they were still hungry afterwards. But it says, as the people were satisfied, I'm sure they had more than enough and they were full and they had all that they wanted. And aside from that, there is also plenty of food left over. And so we see that the Lord, that Yeshua has provided over and way beyond the expectations, I think, that of which the people had at that time, because they might have been looking for some food to have for that moment, but to see that there's such still a large amount of food left over, we see that Yeshua, being the Son of God, he provides more than we would ever think, I believe. And I think that would also be something that would be wise for us to remember, that we don't ever have to be in fear or worry that the Almighty will provide for us in a short way, but that he will always exceed our expectations, and we can always have that hope that he will more than thoroughly and more than adequately provide for the needs that we have, whatever those might be, of course. And so in verse 10, and immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. We see in these few verses that the Pharisees, the religious officials among the Jews, among God's people, they're coming after Yeshua and seeking a sign from him. And most assuredly, if they had been with the multitude, if they had been with the 4,000 people that Yeshua fed, they would have witnessed the miracle firsthand. But apparently they missed that, and they are seeking a sign from Yeshua to test him of who he is, for the Pharisees to be seeking a sign from Yeshua. I'm sure they had different reasons for that, but as far as this time goes, he does not oblige to their request and simply turns away from them. And so in verse 13, leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread, and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Yeshua, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" They said to him, 12. "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" To stop for a second, we see that as Even though the disciples, even though the 12 who would later be called apostles, who were with Yeshua, with Jesus, we see that they would have been on a first-hand basis witnessing the power of God being manifested, and they would have been seeing the works of Yeshua, which he would have been doing as given to him to do by the Father. But it would appear that even though they would have had such a close and personal experience with Yeshua, with the Son of God, that they would have been seeing these things happen right before their eyes, but that it would be apparent that they did not fully comprehend and did not truly understand what they were witnessing, because they give Yeshua the correct answers to the questions that he brings forth to them about how many extra of the food was left over from the feeding of the 5,000 and then the feeding subsequently of the 4,000. They answer him rightly about that. But I don't think that they had fully been aware of Yeshua being the Son of God, that they had quite possibly a small um, uh, a small amount of understanding of Yeshua, but I don't think it would have been likely that they had a complete and a full understanding of who he was and what he had come to do. But whether that's right or not, I just think it would be probably a basic and more reasonable explanation of why the disciples, it says at times, why they also had a hardened heart and why they were seemingly in the dark about some of the things which Yeshua was accusing the Pharisees and the religious officials of, and why Yeshua would speak to them in parables or different things at times, and they would not completely understand, but that would be something to discuss for another time. And so in verse 22, and they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Yeshua and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I see them like trees. For I see them like trees, walking around." Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently, and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." As we see that Yeshua heals a person who is blind, I'm sure that for the person, if he had known what way he would have been healed of his blindness before Yeshua had done that, he might in himself have preferred another way to be healed, but for the simple fact that he was healed of his blindness, I think that would have been more of a cause for celebration, because if we were blind, I'm not sure it's the way that we would want to be healed, to have somebody spit in our eyes. But in whatever case the healing was done, I am fully confident that the man who was blind is, or who, I'm confident that the man who was blind and did receive his sight at this time, that he was definitely grateful and rejoicing to have his sight once again, or to have his sight, period. Because we see in reading the Old Testament, I believe in the book of Kings, I think it's 2 Kings, where there's a ruler from a foreign, there's a very influential man from a foreign land, and he has leprosy, and he goes to, I believe, Elisha or Elisha, and seeking healing for his leprosy. And the answer that he gets is from Elisha to go into the Jordan River and to wash 7 times. And the man is furious at what he hears needs to happen for him to be healed of his leprosy, and so he departs from Elisha. But on the way, when he is traveling back to his homeland, he hears from one of his servants that his servant is telling him, if the task which he would have had to do to be healed was a great and a mighty task, that why wouldn't the man have tried to accomplish that and to get that task done? But the servant then says how much more of a simpler task it would have been for this man to go and wash in the Jordan for the 7 times, because he had the opinion that the rivers in Damascus and his land which he had come from were much better than the Jordan. But when he is of a more understanding nature, and when he hears what the words of his servants are, or what his servants was, then he goes and washes in the Jordan for the 7 times, and upon doing that he is healed. And so immediately it was not the preferred method of healing that this man wanted, but we see when he did humble himself, he was in fact healed. And so also for this blind man, I don't think it would have been the first method on his list of ways being healed to have somebody spit in his eyes, but most certainly that he did receive his sight, I'm sure he would have been okay with it. And so in verse 27, Yeshua went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." To stop here for a minute, we see that Yeshua is bringing about the question to his disciples so that he would hear from them about who the people say that Yeshua is. And although the people have different opinions about who he is, we see ultimately that it's one of the disciples who steps up and says, and that being Peter, who says to Yeshua that he is the Christ, that is to say, he is the Messiah and the Savior. But then after this seemingly profound statement by Peter, for him to say that Yeshua is the Messiah, is the Savior, that he is the Christ, we see that Peter, in hearing about the things that Yeshua is telling his disciples, that he must suffer and be rejected and be killed, it's not very acceptable in Peter's eyes. And so Peter openly calls out Yeshua about this for what he has said. And it's not as though Peter himself is Satan, but as Yeshua is accusing him and saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's." I don't believe that Peter is Satan in the flesh, but that for this brief moment in time, he was influenced, and whether it was Satan speaking through Peter for this time,